Good evening, everybody, and welcome to UMR Connects. My name is Samantha Ream, and I'm a third-year student here at UMR. Thank you for coming tonight as we wrap up our January theme of Adapting Today to Protect Our Future. Just a reminder that UMR Connects is at 7 p.m. every Tuesday night. It's free and open to the public. The theme for February will be the often forgotten prisons, poverty, and homelessness. We hope you'll join us here again next week as Greg Owens presents What Do We Know After 30 Years of Research on Homelessness in Minnesota. And if you haven't already done so, please sign in to get your name into our door prize drawing. The information is only used to let you know of upcoming events, and the winner will receive a $20 gift card to the M-Gear store at the end of the night. And now I'd like to introduce our speaker. Dr. Osterholm is the McKnight Presidential Endowed Chair in Public Health at the University of Minnesota and Director of the Center for Infectious Disease Research and Policy. He's a professor in the Division of Environmental Health Sciences, School of Public Health, a professor in the Technological Leadership Institute at the College of Science and Engineering, and an adjunct professor in the medical school at the University of Minnesota. He's also a member of the Institute of Medicine of the National Academy of Sciences and the Council of Foreign Relations. In June 2005, Dr. Osterholm was appointed by Michael Leavitt, Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services, to the newly established National Science Advisory Board on Biosecurity. In July 2008, he was named to the University of Minnesota Academic Health Center's Academy of Excellence in Health Research, and in 2008, he was appointed to the World Economic Forum Working Group on Pandemics. Dr. Osterholm has been an international leader on the critical concern regarding our preparedness for an influenza pandemic. He has also been an international leader on the growing concern regarding the use of biological agents as catastrophic weapons targeting civilian populations. Dr. Osterholm provides a comprehensive and pointed review of America's current state of preparedness for a bioterrorism attack in his New York Times bestselling book, Living Terrors: What America Needs to Know to Survive the Coming Bioterrorist Catastrophe. Dr. Osterholm has received numerous honors for his work, including an honorary doctorate from Luther College, the Pump Handle Award from the CSTE, the Charles Shepard Science Award from the CDC, the Harvey Wiley Medal from the FDA, the Squibb Award from the IDSA, the Distinguished University Teaching Professor in Environmental Health Sciences at the School of Public Health from the University of Minnesota, and the Wade Hampton Frost Leadership Award from the American Public Health Association. He's also been the recipient of 6 major research awards from the NIH and the CDC. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Osterholm.
Thank you. Good evening. Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. The truth of the matter is, if you live long enough, you can get enough titles behind your name that anything looks good. So let me start out by just saying, and I look at the face of this audience of students here, you've proved the point that age is not a time of life, it's a state of mind. And I look at how young you all are out here. I know you wouldn't be here if you weren't interested in this topic. Well, tonight I'm going to share with you kind of a sense of where we're at in the world with the issue of infectious diseases. And you cannot deal with infectious diseases if you just don't deal with the whole world, because everything's interconnected. A whole lot of dots end up making for a line. And I think, as you'll see tonight, I would probably say a third of my slides, maybe a quarter, are all within the last 3 to 4 days. That's just how fast things move in our business. And in fact, I was downloading new slides after I got here, because from the time I left Minneapolis till now, a couple of things happened. So that I'll try to give you a sense of what it is like to be in our business and what that means for you. Now, I look across this room here, and I do say, while I appreciate the youth and thinking, I do know a number of you probably have grandchildren. And let me just say at the outset, you know, when I was young and crazy and, you know, on boundless energy and thought I was going to save the world, you know, there was any number of reasons why I did what I did, and it meant a lot. But today I have one central focus that I'm reminded of every day when I get up and every night when I go to bed. I have grandchildren. And I think to myself, what in the hell are we doing leaving the world we're leaving now, our generation, to that group of grandchildren? And so when I work today, I don't have any problem trying to figure out why I do what I do, because it's not about me, it's about my grandchildren. And tonight I hope this presentation will reflect a bit of that issue. Now, the title of my talk was about looking at it through the windshield and the rearview mirror of kind of the thing. I've been in the business now for over 40 years. And when I think back on how I got into it and what happened, a lot has changed since then. So there surely is a whole lot to understand or learn from looking through the rear view mirror. But really, when you look ahead, too, you have to understand what's coming. And change is coming faster and faster and faster. I've seen more change in what I do, the issues that we're confronted with, and how we do it in the last 5 to 10 years than I did in the previous 30. And each year it gets faster and faster and faster. And that's really one of the complexities we have today. And tonight my presentation will hopefully describe that to you. Last count I had about 45,000 electronic slides that if we actually ever had an electronic fire, I'd have to figure out which one to save. This is the slide I would save. This is probably the most important slide I own. While it's a bit old in the sense it goes to the year 2000, this slide really shows the world that we live in today. In 1850, we at that time had about 500 million people on the face of the earth. Today we have actually 7.8 billion people. 1 out of every 8 people who's ever lived since the caves is now on the face of the earth. 1 out of every 8. And we got to feed those people. We got to do a whole lot of other things with them. Also, the fact is the fastest growth in human population today is in the megacities of the developing world. Dickens could not have described conditions as deplorable as we see in the developing world today in terms of the potential for infectious disease transmission and the development of infectious agents. So that when we look at some of the problems we have today, they didn't even exist 25 or 30 years ago because the conditions didn't exist. When you look at actual travel here, it hasn't really gotten a lot faster since 1950. That's true. But what goes around the world has changed dramatically. And I'll show you that in a moment, that what it is today, oceans, mountains, canyons, they mean nothing. I mean, just even think back, take a step back from infectious diseases. Do you remember when we were growing up, did we ever talk about milfoil and zebra mussels and all these other things? We didn't. Well, just as it's happening to our environment, the same thing is true with infectious diseases. I think about the fact that not long ago, I was in Hyderabad, India, early one morning. I gave a lecture at the University of Minnesota that night. Same night. That's how fast we move around the world today, and you'll see what that means for infectious diseases. Now, if one looks at life expectancy since 1900, we surely have improved from about 48 years up now, and if you look at where we're at about 2010, at about 78 years. Think about this. 80,000 generations from the caves to 1900, and we had 48 years of life expectancy. Today, at 78 years, for every 3 days we've lived in the last century, we've gained 1 day of life expectancy. That's incredible. Why was that? It was largely public health, because what happened is life expectancy drops dramatically when young people die a lot. So when you have somebody that's is aged 1 and somebody that's aged 79, that's a total of 80 years. Half of that, if one dies, is 40 years of life expectancy, whereas if 2 people die 79 and 80, life expectancy is 79.5 years. So bottom line is it's by making sure young people don't die. And I want to point out tonight that we're going to show that there have been a lot of successes. When you think about the fact in Rochester, Minnesota in 1900, one of the #1 causes of death of kids was typhoid fever. Today we'd be chagrined to think of a case like that. But we're going to talk more about that. Now, when we look at overall improvement in life expectancy, you can see here for most developed regions of the world, it's fairly high, and it's not getting a whole lot higher. I mean, I think some of us would agree here. None of us want to live to be 120 and the last 20 years of that life be kind of incapacitated, okay? I mean, I hate to tell you all this, but everyone in this room is going to die. Now, depending on your religious beliefs, 1 or 2 of you may get out alive, but most everybody else is going to die. And there'll always be a top 10 causes of death. And if we eliminate the top 10 we have now, there'll be 10 new ones. And I'm not sure the 10 new ones are going to be better than the 10 we have now. So when they find me face down in my trout stream down in northeast Iowa with a big brook trout on when I'm 93, please do not call that cardiovascular death a failure. That was not. That was a success, okay? But I can surely tell you if people die early in life and they die from preventable diseases like infectious diseases, that's not good. And as you can see here, even though we're making inroads in the developing world, we still have a big gap between us and them. And one of the things you're going to see is what we're worried about today is not just that these diseases occur in the developing world, but their spread to the rest of the world is a very real piece. Now, I want to add the positive note. First of all, one of my real heroes in the world is Bill Gates. Bill and Melinda Gates have done what no other foundation has done in history. $48 billion endowment. In the last 10 years, they have done what other governments used to do, public health agencies used to do with their funds. It's remarkable. And Bill just issued this report last week in which he talks about we're going to see child deaths will go down by half and more diseases will be eradicated than ever before. And he's talking about over the next decades. Africa will be able to feed itself. Mobile banking will help the poor radically transform their lives. And better software will revolutionize learning. I so want to believe this. I so want to believe this. And I don't take away anything from Mr. Gates because he has really earned all of our honors and respect. But Mr. Gates was also telling us that 8 years ago, polio would be eradicated in a year or two. And it's not, and it's getting worse. And I think that what we have to do is basically balance the ideal, what we hope will happen, why we think it might happen, with what is the reality. I'm a distance swimmer, or I at least have been in my past life. And I can tell you the difference between swimming in a calm body of water or swimming with the current or swimming against the current. And imagine if I'm actually in a calm body of water and I swim 3 miles an hour. After 3 hours, I'm 9 miles away. But if I'm in a river where the water is actually going 4 miles an hour downstream and I'm swimming upstream, at the end of 3 hours, I'm 3 miles downstream. And so one of the things we're going to talk about tonight is what is this head current like? What are we up against as a complex world? Well, these are slides that were shown over the weekend at Davos, the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland. And I think they really tell us a lot about where we're at. First of all, if you look, you can see world population. This is the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, the 34 larger countries of the world, including the United States. And if you look here for world population, we've really achieved that leveling off. And at the point now where we're not seeing the big growth. But if you look at the BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, you can see how that has occurred. But look at the other countries. This is where we're seeing the big growth. And where you have that uncontrolled growth, you have a whole lot of other things to go with it. You have poverty, you have a lack of infrastructure, you don't have the services that we think of often of just water and electricity, etc. That's also where we see many of the disease problems developing. If we look at this, take no further look than just a shot from a couple of years ago. Mumbai, India. Boy, you have to say that's a modern city, and yet look at the slums right next to it. Over the past summer, I've been very involved with the issue of Ebola. I've been in the larger cities of Central Africa. I've been in the 3 million population slum of Kinshasa. I've been in Kibera, the 1 million population slum of Nairobi that took me 2 weeks to get the odor out of my nose. When you look at those massive population issues and you see what's happened, you realize the disease potential that's there. And the fact that this is really a very key piece. If you look at the real GDP, again, you can see that we've done really well here in these countries here, but look at the rest of the world. Think about this. Last week, as part of this announcement, it was recognized that right now 80 people in the world own half of all the wealth. And the distinguishing feature between the haves and have-nots growing bigger and bigger and bigger. And where there is have-nots is where infectious diseases occur. It's poverty, it's social inequality, it's those issues. And so the world's getting richer, but it ain't getting distributed. When you look at foreign direct investment, look no further, because you'll see here, again, with the OECD countries, you can see, again, these are all slides from Davos this weekend, the World Economic Forum, Davos, Switzerland. You can see even our investment among the OECD countries has dropped substantially, where it's gone up somewhat in the BRIC and other countries, but it's not sustained. Right now, you can't get in a company to go into Liberia, Sierra Leone, or Guinea to do any investment of any kind, because they're afraid of what the Ebola situation has done. And when you can't do that, that country basically is sunk. How the hell do you bail out a boat that's already 120 feet underwater? That's a real problem. Primary energy use, let me just tell you right now, tonight I'm not going to have time to get into all the issues around climate change and infections. It's real, it's going to happen, it's going to actually... Anybody know here at the Mayo Clinic, you all should tell me what the Mayo Clinic was started for? Why was the Mayo Clinic started? Anybody know? What? No, tornado had nothing to do with it. Anybody know what the Mayo Clinic was started for? It was malaria hospitals for Civil War vets. The tornado is what made it a community hospital. The first time the Mayo brothers opened their door to the community was in fact with the tornado, and then the sisters came and helped. But before that, we had indigenous malaria all over southern Minnesota and the northern states. It was a real problem. Well, today we have seen the inroads made in vector control. Mosquito control around the world have just completely been boshed. They're gone. And if I could show you a map of how that's changed, it would just floor you to see how that's changed. Well, energy and mosquitoes, where they live, where ticks live, where a lot of things live, are going to change dramatically with climate change. And the diseases that we once thought were so far distant are actually not going to be so distant. And look at this. I mean, we're now talking about our hope is that we can level off this, not keep the growth. You know, the climate change issue is already happening. You're in the intersection, you're going 93 miles an hour, you are 1 millimeter away from that big semi, and it's not a matter of if, it's just a matter of what it's going to be like. And so again, we could have a whole series of lectures on infectious diseases and climate change. It's going to be real. If we look at the issue around water, today, large dams, here it's leveled off a bit, but again, if you look, large dams there, if you want to see major infectious diseases, every time there's been a dam project, we've had terrible problems with infectious diseases. There are so many parasites and so many certain kinds of worm-like agents that live in the waters where these dams are made. And people never think about that. We need the water for irrigation, we need the water for energy, but there are also a lot of problems that nobody thought about. Water itself is going to become the absolute weapon that we'll fight over in the future. It will be the issue upon not oil, not gas, not coal, it'll be water. And unless we can come up with a magical way to make desalinization really cheap and easy to do, we're going to see water becomes more and more of an issue. And it's because we not only are using all the surface water, and now with climate change, we're seeing that we may get the same precipitation, but instead of getting it over a period of 12 months, we get 2 big storms like we've seen right here in southeastern Minnesota. My property down in Iowa has had 3 1,000-year storms in the last 7 years. I mean, it's this flashy water and then this big drought kind of situation. Well, this is going to be a problem. The other thing is we've done is we've drilled out all the water. I mentioned being in Hyderabad, India. I was there 20 years ago when a well was drilled in a particular field and it went down 40 feet. I was there 2 years ago. That well is now dry at 415 feet. We've used up the groundwater. So again, that's not getting replaced. That also has a lot to do with infectious diseases, because if you want to prevent infectious diseases, water becomes important. It's basically the solvent of removing organisms from your body, and it's the solvent that removes them from out of the environment. Think about this. 50% of India still indiscriminately defecates wherever they want to. No toilets. 50% of the population in India. You want to know how it is to control infectious diseases there? It's tough. Even our food sources. Look what we've done again with marine fish capture. You can see how that's really been an issue there. It's already collapsed. It's on its way down. Feeding the world's population is going to become increasingly complicated. And in many parts of the world, it's the marine fish that have actually sustained some of the poorest countries in the world. If we look at tropical rainforest loss, obviously that's increasing to try to feed this increasing world. But if you want to know where the worst place to go look for infectious agents in terms of actually finding them is, it's tropical rainforest. Just as there's the genetic diversity of plants, animals, it's also the microbes. Now think about this. You got a bunch of bats in Indonesia who basically got wiped out of their habitat. They literally took all the rainforest down. How the hell they did this, we don't know, but they literally flew from Indonesia to northern Australia. And they found new tropical rainforests in Australia. But at the same time that people were building new farms into this tropical rainforest, and suddenly we had exotic viruses going from these bats in the tropical rainforest of Australia, which hadn't been there 20 years before, and now they're starting to kill horses and pigs and transmitting it to humans. And a whole new set of viruses, all because of A plus B plus C plus D. These are the problems that we're trying to deal with all the time. This is the one that I think is really the critical underlay of our challenges today, and that is failed states. Failed states is defined as countries which may have little, if any, real governance, chaos, corruption, etc. If you look, this is the bar over here from high alert, warning, stable to sustainable. Look at most of that world. Today, 34 nations in the world are considered basically in total failed state status. In 1973, when the United States and the USSR decided we're going to eradicate smallpox, which was a major public health event, it was pretty simple to do. It was like knocking over dominoes. Because when those two countries decided to do something, everybody else in the world fell in line, because everybody was a satellite of the US or the former Soviet Union. Nobody raised questions. Nobody asked anything, said, what do we do? Today, we can't get 3 countries to agree on anything. Nobody is in control. And so if we want to eradicate polio, we got a real challenge in our hands, as we'll come back to in a moment, because no one can tell another country or group of countries what to do. When you have failed state status like this, it makes it very difficult. And I can tell you right now, right here, even in this part of West Africa, that's been one of the problems. It's not just a lack of infrastructure, it's a lack of everything. Think of this right now. In the United States, we're running about 250 physicians. Obviously, Olmsted County is the total anomaly, but we're running about 250 physicians per 100,000 population. In Liberia right now, it's less than 1 physician per 100,000 population. You know what you can do in a country like that? It's tough. In terms of this, I mentioned polio. This is from the January 20th edition of the International Tribune. Fight against disease, policeman guarding polio team shot dead. We've now had 97 polio eradicators in Afghanistan and Pakistan in the last 18 months that have been assassinated by the Taliban because it's seen as a Western effort. And we actually have some reasons that they're right. Why? Because the CIA, unbeknownst to us, 4 years ago, launched on trying to find bin Laden, set up a series of health clinics in Pakistan in which they took throat swabs from people, disguising it as a real health program, and all they were looking for was DNA of the bin Laden family, because we knew what his DNA was, and that's how they ultimately centered in on where the hell he was. And now, every clinic we do, health clinic-wise, they have every reason to think it's just another plot by our CIA. I mean, when we found out in public health they were doing this, we were shocked and chagrined. And now we'll live with those residual tales for a long time. But think about combating polio, ill planning, security lapses, Hanford drives. This is not smallpox eradication, where everybody got on board. Everybody got behind the purpose. Think about northern Nigeria, where we still have a major focus of polio activity. Anybody convinced Boko Haram not only just to give up the girls, but to actually work on polio eradication? No. So these are challenges we never had before. The world is a very different place. And since I grew up and any of you grew up, it's a different place. Now, a number of years ago, we started talking about this concept of emergent infections, new infections that were suddenly appearing for reasons that we otherwise, wouldn't have thought in the past. When I got into this business in 1975, I was at the University of Minnesota, and everybody looked at me like, what in the hell are you going to go and invest your career in horse and buggies? Infectious diseases are dead and gone. They're over with. We won that battle. Well, and to a certain degree, they were right. We had made a lot of inroads. But since that time, so many world conditions have changed that have now resulted in really what I would call a whole new world order, a new normal. In 1992, the National Academy of Science Institute of Medicine actually came up with the concept of emergent infections in its first report. A 10-year report later called Microbial Threats to Health, of which I was actually part of this group, elaborated on what was done in 1992. And what we came up with is a definition, which in a moment I'll show you was actually incomplete, but new re-emergent or drug-resistant infections whose incidence in humans has increased in the past 2 decades or whose incidence threatens to increase in the near future. That's what emergent infections are. We should have said in animals or humans, because animals play a key role in this too. And we couldn't get the human-centric folks on the committee to agree to include animals. Now in retrospect, everybody realizes that so many diseases actually get transmitted from animals to humans or vice versa. But that's what we're talking about. And we have a whole Sears catalog now of these new diseases that we hadn't had. Human demographics and travel, behavior, I've already shared with you the concept of the world population, how to feed that population, what that means to live in these squalor conditions. Technology and industry. Let me just give you one example. I could give you hundreds. Unintended consequences. And I tell you this actually because this was one of the diseases I cut my teeth on. Our group was the ones that discovered toxic shock syndrome in the early days and did much of the pioneering work on understanding the relationship between tampons and this illness. It was caused by a Staph aureus bacteria that produced a toxin, a really bad poison. And the way that happened is after the paper companies figured out how to really make superabsorber materials, things would hold 25 and 30 times its weight in fluid for disposable diapers for kids in daycare and in your homes, they said, heck, we'll put those in tampons. And then women will no longer have tampon accidents, is one of the things they feared. Well, when they did that, they went from tampons that held 2 to 3 grams of menstrual fluid to tampons that hold 25 to 30 grams of menstrual fluid. What they didn't understand was, or none of us did, is that the female vagina, which is an anaerobic environment, no oxygen in it, when you put one of those tampons, there was this big burst of oxygen and suddenly became oxygen-rich, and nobody knew that the Staph aureus living in that vagina, which did otherwise live just fine there, suddenly in the presence of oxygen pumped all this toxin out and started killing lots of young women. We had no idea of connecting the dots between high absorbency, oxygen in a body space, a bacteria and a toxin, and killing people. I could give you a laundry list of products today or things that we've never thought an unintended consequence. In healthcare today, we have figured out how to violate every body orifice and create a whole lot of new ones. And, we were not intended to have all those new body openings. And we weren't intended to do so some of the body openings what we do. Today, the infectious diseases we have there are remarkable. Economic development and land use, again, we change things all the time. Do you know that Rochester literally sat in the open, it was a big prairie here? Most of southeastern Minnesota didn't have trees. I can go back and show you the early lithographs showing along Mississippi in a stretch of 5 miles, 100 trees, that's it. Why? Because the Native Americans burnt this all the time. This was part of the prairie. Do you know you didn't have many ticks back then when that happened year after year after year? Suddenly, with land use and all the trees coming back over the last 150 years and the animal populations changing, suddenly now we have a whole new environment for things like ticks that now transmit diseases like Lyme disease and anaplasmosis and all these other things that would never happen for thousands of years. And while people don't think that we didn't have many trees here, I can tell you, we know very well from our studies, and I do a lot of work in prairie restoration, that's an example of that. International travel and commerce, I'll come back to that, but this is the thing right now that moves it. We now move everything around the world all the time on a real-time basis, and that's one of the reasons. This one's a key one, microbial adaptation and change. This is the gravity of microbes, the evolution. Think about this. I'm 61 years old. On the day I was born, if an E. coli bacteria was born on that same day, I've now gone through 2.5 generations of human time, okay? That E. coli bacteria has gone through 1.5 million generations. And you know what? Many of those generations, they might have had mutations that screwed them up and they died. They just didn't do well. But a lot of those mutations were another throw at the genetic roulette table, and they actually survived the pressures of things like antibiotics or other things that happened, or they survived all these ways. Folks, microbial evolution favors them every time. Josh Letterberg, who chaired this IOM committee, this Institute of Medicine committee I mentioned, that the second book, is quoted in the book as saying, the bugs were here before us, they're here why we're here, and they're going to be here long after we're gone. This is huge right here, and this is why we're losing our antibiotics, because they're figuring out how to get around all of it, and it's a very simple process. They don't think in the sense that we think, they just think with evolution. Breakdown of public health measures, you're going to hear about this more and more and more. And in part of my talk today, I'm going to talk about what the head of the World Bank said about 4 hours ago about public health measures. And it's not pretty, and it's true, and you'll hear about that in a minute. Human susceptibility to infection. You know what? When we didn't live that old, we didn't get a lot of the cancers. We didn't get a lot of the immune-suppressed diseases that we have today. And thank God we were able to live with them. I mean, everyone would say it's a great success. But we have to acknowledge we're a much more immune-suppressed population as we grow older and we have these chronic diseases and so forth. And is it really safe for you to drink the Rochester water city, or city water? Do you know if it is or not? Because the microbes that might be in that are not microbes that we worry about causing disease in normal, healthy people. But you know that 20,000 people a year in this country still develop Legionnaire's disease from water systems, from just taking a shower? And when they're immune deficient, they are at risk for that. Do you know whether you have Legionella in your bacteria in your water? Most systems do. So part of it is, as we've grown older, we've now seen new diseases that we really hadn't seen before because of this issue. Climate and weather I mentioned before. I'll only say again that it's going to impact us. It's just not yet. Changing ecosystems, the idea that we're pouncing into these rainforests, we're changing the world into high concentration agricultural practices. Do you know that, in fact, today there are more animals on the face of the earth than any time in history? You say, well, that can't be true. We've destroyed most of the animal populations. Concentrated animal operations today make up for that. One of the areas I'm going to mention in just a minute. Anybody know what the average time is from a chicken being hatched in that egg until that chicken breast is on your plate today? What's the average time? Anybody know?
6 weeks.
What?
6 weeks.
Anybody else? 6 weeks?
30
Going?
days.
What?
30 days.
35 days. Once a month. You got a chick all the way to a full-grown chicken. Right now, in the peri-urban region of Shanghai, to feed the 20-some million people, they grow 750 new chickens every month. Every month. Just to feed that population, one city in China. And you want to know if viruses or bacteria can start to grow in populations like that? Pretty remarkable. You'll see in a minute. Poverty and social inequality, I won't say more than that except for one comment I'm going to make, and if you were taking my class, you'd know all about this because we have the data to support it. The single most important thing we could do today to improve the lot of public health across the world is the empowerment of women. When women are not empowered, there's not education, you have high fertility rates, you have very high infant mortality rates, and you have all the sundry things that go with all the conditions of poverty that are basically about infectious diseases. And we can surely show you the data that supports when you bring up the entire lot of the human condition, you really do begin to address the issue of infectious diseases. War and famine. Very few people know that in every war in the 20th century, many more people died from infectious diseases than died from the war itself. Every one of them. Even right now, and we look at Syria and so forth, we got many more people dying from infectious disease than we do from the actual war itself. And again, it's lack of infrastructure, inability to respond. Lack of political will, I'm not sure what that is anymore. I'm an agnostic when it comes to politics. I've served the last 4 presidential administrations, and I've never seen what I would call the constipation of political will more than I see now. And we'll comment on that more in a moment. And then finally, the intent to harm. Today, we can do with microbes is amazing. In the 1990s, the University of Wisconsin at Madison sequenced the first E. coli bacteria for about $4 million, and it took them 4 years to do it. We genetically laid out the whole thing. Today, we can sequence an E. coli bacteria in our labs for $1.50 in one morning. One morning. That's how much we've changed and what we can do to these bugs today. We can really make the designer bugs. This gives you an idea of travel. This is a true family history. Great-great-great-grandfather lived in northwest of England, and over the course of his lifetime, this is 10 kilometers, this is his entire travel history. Entire. From birth to death. Then along came grandfather, who actually made it to the big town of London. He actually did. It was a big deal. Still 100 kilometers really defined his sphere of interest and activity. And then along came Dad, who went and served in World War II. And although he made it to the mainland, he actually went back and spent most of his time here, and this is the son. Look at that. I know that very well. I'm from northeast Iowa, and I had never been out of northeast Iowa, literally, until I was in college. My mother really has never left northeast Iowa. And I get a phone call from my son one day saying, Dad, tell me a little bit more about this malaria thing. And I said, what the? He was on the beach in Thailand. I had no idea he was even gone. Yeah, he travels like, I go to the 7-Eleven. He travels like that all the time. It's a whole new world order. This slide I want to share with you. This is actually flights here in the world, with nighttime being right here. And you'll see each one of these is a flight over the last 24 hours. Here's 6 o'clock in the morning, midnight. Look at that. The lights were off. You could see it even better. Each one of those is a huge plane, lots of people, and a cargo hold that's jam-packed. Imagine what's going around the world right now and where it's going. See how it migrates through? You can see Asia waking up. You can see us going over now during the middle of the night. All the activity in Europe. Limited activity in Africa, but it's still there. Isn't that amazing? That's what happens every day. Next slide. You can just go. Thanks. Yeah, you just get down there. Okay. People moving. 7.8 billion people on the face of the earth. Last year, almost 1.1 billion people crossed an international border. We travel with such frequency today, international borders are almost meaningless. This is a shot from yesterday morning I took. We take this every hour on the hour. I just didn't make a new slide. This is all the ships in the world, the large cargo ships. Every hour on the hour, they report their weather status. That's where you can tell when there's big hurricanes or whatever, because they'll vacate certain areas. Even here, most of the ships actually are in port right up here right now. A gap. Normally would be a lot more ships there because of the storm. Those are the warehouses of the modern world. One of the big fast freighters from Shanghai to Long Beach, California, 9 days. They're in the harbor for 20 hours, unload, load, refuel, and they're gone. That sound is from that, if you can shut that sound off. Sorry, it's from that slide. There you go. It's an airplane. There you go. Got it. Thanks. It wasn't me, trust me. These cargo holds are filled with God knows what, including lots of mosquitoes, insects, ballast water, you name it. They're moving all the time. Let's move to Ebola. I just want to give you a sense of this because this is one that caught public health in the world by surprise. It shouldn't have, but it did. Ebola virus is actually named after the Ebola River in the Democratic Congo, the Republic of the Congo. It was discovered in 1976 as the first big outbreak big, not that big, 30-some cases. But the point of it is that in the in the 40 years since that, there have been 24 outbreaks or isolated case occurrences documented. 20 were community-wide outbreaks, but they only involved a total of 2,400 cases. So from 1976 until 2013-14, we'd only had 2,400 cases of Ebola ever that we documented. Now, we may have had it beforehand, but like the first outbreak was a 2.5-day walk from the nearest road to get into that little village. Not much. The most numbers of transmissions we had before of Ebola Zaire was 5, meaning from 1 person to 2 people to 3 to 4 to 5, and we got it stopped. This virus has hardly pinged humans before. We really had no idea what was going on here. I mean, it really was very rare. Well, with it we now do know, and we did then knew a fair amount, but we're learning more all the time, that clearly direct contact is what happens here with body fluids from an infected person or an animal, including blood, vomit, feces, possible perspiration. Today, I'll only say fever, which has become the hallmark of Ebola prevention, is really not a hallmark at all. In many cases, up to 25% of people never have a fever with Ebola. So we surely shouldn't have been using that as our marker. Airborne transmission is an issue. We have a paper coming out very shortly from a number of major Ebola virologists. All agree airborne transmission is real. It's more limited in the patient setting, but it sure could become more over time. And worker safety was an issue we've been highlighting for some time, which obviously became a reality here in this country. It really has been and will continue to be about Africa. The way virus occurs is we believe that the primary reservoir is in bat populations, or at least a large part of it is in certain bats. Bats there are frequently eaten. If you've ever seen a fruit bat, it's like about the size of a football with a wingspan about this long. They actually are quite big delicacies there. And yet we know that bats may be infected with this. Then it gets into other populations like subhuman primates, other animals, from either contact with sick or dying bats. Very few people realize in 2003, 4, and 5, much of a 9,000 population gorilla colony in the Congo was almost wiped out because of Ebola virus infection. And then occasionally it gets to humans when they come in contact with this, an infected animal, including bats. This is the belt where we've mostly worried about Ebola. Now, of course, it's here over in West Africa. And we shouldn't have been surprised. I wrote this piece in July in the Washington Post when nobody seemed to be listening to this. Some in this room would know that, I say, well, here's Osterholm again, just scaring the hell out of us needlessly. I would urge you to go back and just look at when we've made predictions and what's happened with them. But here in this article, I talked about the fact that this was a very different outbreak and that the world needed to wake up, that this had the ability to destabilize West Africa. And at this point, no American physicians had become infected. It was not on anybody's news media screen. The WHO was not following up very much. Well, we soon learned what happened when this got into the inner cities of Monrovia, Freetown, and Conakry, and what really happened. Today we have over 21,000 cases reported with Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone. This is the area that we continue to see case increases, but we're starting to see actually some increase in cases in Guinea. Of the 21,000 cases, 8,600 have died. This is the area of West Africa here where we continue to see activity. It has greatly reduced from where it was, which is good public health practice. Identifying cases early, isolating them, making sure medical care practices. Over 800 cases have occurred in healthcare workers, just from the contact that you have with these patients with inadequate infection control practices. If you look at the curve, we surely have broken its back, but it's not done. It's like a forest fire. If you put out 95% of it, don't put out the other 5%, it flares back quickly if you take all your troops and go home. There's been lots of questions about how many cases would occur. This is where public health has done itself such a disservice. People have asked me, dating back to June and July, how many cases we have. I kept saying lots and lots. I don't know how many. The CDC came out and said we'd have 1.5 million, which we surely haven't. I think that was really unfortunate. Still, the 20-some thousand is a big deal considering we had 2,400 in the previous 40 years. We learned things about burial practices and so forth that culturally very different. Do you know that in these countries, in a number of instances, the dead are revered not just on the day of their funeral, but for life? Twice a year, they actually have ceremonies where you go and spend the entire day on the grave of your loved one and connecting with them, and it's critical. So when we decided that the way to keep people from having all the contact with bodies during the funeral was to cremate them, do you realize that would be absolutely like saying we're going to shut down the Mayo Clinic and we're going to farm it out to Gunderson? I mean, I think a lot of people around here say, wait a minute, okay? I mean, that's exactly what we did, and we had to learn how to deal with these populations. And the fact that, yes, they might have had a lot of contact with the body, but we couldn't do that anymore, and this is why. Because these bodies were still infectious. This is from this week, the 26th here, from the Doctors Without Borders, encouraging decline in Ebola cases, but critical gaps remain. My biggest fear is we're almost going to get the vehicle stopped so we don't have a collision, but then that last 10 feet, we forget about the brake and we still hit, and it still does a lot of damage, you know? And so we've got to finish this issue off. Now, one of the areas we're working on a lot is vaccines. Our group has been quite involved with this. We don't have a vaccine yet, but we think we surely can have vaccines. And in fact, there's a roadmap with how to get those. Our group is doing this. I co-chair an international group with Jeremy Farrer from the Wellcome Trust, and our group at CIDRAP convened a group of 28 international experts, and we have been working on just what is it going to take to get an Ebola vaccine and how to study it, particularly in this time of decreasing cases. The trial is surely challenged right now as cases tumble, so we have this great conundrum. When we were seeing 5,000 to 6,000 new cases a month for a while there, boy, we could do the studies and quickly determine, does this vaccine work or not by vaccinating some of the population, not others, and seeing what happens. But now when you're down to hundreds or tens of cases, we may not be able to show whether the vaccine works because we weren't ready to go at the time. And so one of the challenges we had, how are we going to demonstrate whether this really works for the future? This is our group that I just mentioned, the Wellcome Trust, and our group from the university. This is our first report that came out on January 12th. Next week we're issuing a huge report about how are we going to jerry-rig this current system to figure out whether these vaccines work or not. And this is a real challenge. We want the cases to go away. But if they go away, we're going to have a hard time trying to figure out if these vaccines work. In addition, WHO has received a lot of negative publicity about how prepared it was or wasn't. I can tell you when I wrote that article in the Washington Post in July, I was frustrated as hell with the lack of international response that was going on. Over the weekend, the executive board of the WHO met, actually had a very stern warning for WHO, it must change, that this is not the public health agency we need in the 21st century. And it's not just for Ebola, it's for a lot of things. I'm going to talk about this. This afternoon, Jim Kim, president of the World Bank, and one of my colleagues was on that report that I mentioned earlier from the Institute of Medicine, issued this. He said this afternoon that the world is dangerously unprepared for future pandemics. He's absolutely right. We really are. We basically still have the old horse and wagon fire truck for all of Rochester. That's it. And if people knew how ill-prepared we were, they would be shocked. And we're going to see more and more spread of these bugs. We're going to see more and more of these issues come up. This isn't about being, altruistic. This is about being strategic. We worried desperately. If Ebola had continued to move through Central Africa, which it very well could have, nobody thought it was going to do what it did in West Africa. Do you know those are all the same countries right now where we worry desperately? Not only just about the populations and the people there and what this will do, these are the same countries where we also see the breeding grounds right now for ISIS. And if you want to talk about a strategic investment, you don't want to see any more failed state status in those countries. That's really a critical piece. Well, let me take a quick move here to another topic very briefly, and that is the issue of coronaviruses, or viruses that have the kind of spike-like corona around them. And this was really brought home back in 2003 with SARS. This condition here, the severe acute respiratory syndrome, that started in China. We actually had this come to the forefront when a physician from the Guangdong province, where this virus, which had come from bats, got into food supply animals, and then got into humans, went and stayed at the Metropole Hotel in Hong Kong. Ironically, he stayed in room 911. And you can see the circle of what happened with this one contact by just being in the same elevator or just staying on the same floor with him. And suddenly it spread around the world. And large outbreaks like in Toronto, where we had one individual who ended up going to Canada here and then ended up having close contacts, and ultimately Canada ended up having hundreds and hundreds of cases. A number of healthcare workers died. Well, we learned here that healthcare workers and household members are the primary risk factor. We didn't have lots of community transmission, but we had it happen, fortunately, largely when it got outside of China in countries where we had good infection control in hospitals. We know that clearly droplets and fomites, that close contact was there. We had some evidence of airborne transmission, particularly in certain emergency rooms. And then we even had one apartment building in Hong Kong, a 42,000 person apartment building, where they had a sewage backup near where one of the cases was residing, and then additional cases occurred where the sewage backup occurred. So we don't know if it was really that or not. But the point was there were ultimately 8,000 cases, 774 deaths, and we were able to bring it under control by eliminating the food source. It was badger dogs and civet cats, which are both rodents, actually not dogs and cats, were taken out of the live markets of Guangdong province, and that stopped the transmission to humans, so the faucet got turned off, but then we were also able to contain it in humans itself. Well, lo and behold, in September of 2012, an Egyptian pathologist, Ali Mohammed Zaki, in Saudi Arabia, found a patient that he thought looked just like SARS, but it wasn't the SARS virus. Well, with further work, they figured out that, in fact, it actually was a brand new coronavirus, just like SARS, but different, meaning the fact that it had all the same principles and so forth, but it was a different thing. It was like the two Jeffrey Paul Petersons I have in my life. I actually do have two dear friends, both Jeffrey Paul Peterson, but they were different. Well, it turns out we started seeing this big increase in MERS, or Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, a very similar illness where over 60% of the patients are dying. And this basically occurred first a little peak in the early spring of 2013, then another peak in the spring of 2014, and now we are quickly, and these numbers do not include what's just happened here in the last week, a big increase in humans again on the Arabian Peninsula. I actually went over last April with one of our Mayo Clinic colleagues, and we actually worked in the investigation in Abu Dhabi on this very issue in the United Arab Emirates. And if you look, you can see here just through January, while this is the mother lode of infections here, look at all the transportation issues that have come to play. This is not going to stay on the Arabian Peninsula. We're going to see more and more of these cases arriving, like arrived in Toronto with SARS. But what we figured out is bats, again, a key role. Isn't that bats come up a lot? But it gets into camels. And that's because the bat droppings of the camel areas, eating fruits or figs that may have bat droppings on them. And then it gets into the population in the sense of either through healthcare and large outbreaks in healthcare settings or just in the community itself. But the key issue is camels. We've now isolated this virus from camels, and I got to tell you, till I went over to Asia, or to the Middle East, I had no real firm appreciation of camels. I mean, I thought I knew a lot about them. But let me tell you, they make service dogs in this country seem like beasts of burden. Camels are the reason these populations survived for 4,000 years in the deserts. Go look at every one of the country's flags has a camel on it. And if you want to talk something bad about camels in those countries, you might as well call my sister a whore. Okay? Because that's how it's perceived. It's bad. And so we had a real challenge on our hands to try to say camels may be involved with this situation. What do you do? We also saw where camels are very, very expensive. Many of those camels run many millions of dollars that are owned over there. Now, the problem is that we now see this virus in the camels on the Arabian Peninsula, and it looks like the virus cycles with the presence or the calving process that occurs where they shed the virus more frequently during the months of December, January, February, March, April, May. When you look at these camels, these are the one-humpers, the dromedary camels, not the Bactrim camels, which are the two-humpers. When you look at dromedary camels, there are about 12.5 million camels, dromedary camels in the world. Only 1.5 million are right here. 10.5 million are right here. This virus has not yet crossed the Red Sea, but it's like keeping milfoil out of our lakes. It's just a matter of time. We have done nothing to prepare Africa for this. I mean, on the Arabian Peninsula, they have unlimited resources. They bring in healthcare workers from around the world. They can handle this quite well, even though they're not doing a very good job of handling it. But in Eastern Africa, there are no resources to deal with this, and nobody's planning for this. And I say to you, sure as hell, in the next 2 to 3 years, we're going to see major outbreaks of MERS in Eastern Africa here, and we're all going to say, how could that have happened? Just like we were saying, how did Ebola happen in West Africa? We know that infection control is a huge issue in terms of healthcare facilities. If you look at healthcare facilities in Eastern Africa and infection control, it barely exists. In terms of also protection, again, our group had, this is from our center, had commented early on talking about the problems with protecting workers and that we weren't protecting them adequately, and we've seen a number of healthcare workers get infected. This is a paper that was published this past year in May when we had 2 healthcare workers from the United States who came back here from working in Saudi Arabia, and both got sick here and were immediately recognized. The reason I point this out to you, because we just looked at the month of May and June. Look at the number of travelers by number that came from Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates to the United States on a 1-month basis. That's world travel. It's not going to stay out. We're going to see it. So one day, don't be surprised if the Mayo Clinic is in the middle, or St. Mary's or Methodist, in the middle of a huge crisis with MERS. This is the new world order. We know today we have big gaps in understanding how it's transmitted, exactly what we can do to prevent it. Treatments are really, really a long ways off. We don't have any vaccines. We've tried very hard to get them to invest in animal vaccines, thinking that would really be the way to go. Because animal vaccines, if we get camels vaccinated, we'd keep it from getting to people. But where we're at is a long ways off. Air travel surely has changed the risk picture for these kinds of diseases. Let me just close with one last disease area that I really want to just mention. If we look at the world of influenza, this is a world that has been with us dating back to antiquity. Anyone know which came first, the chicken or the egg? Which came first? Chicken. This is a trivia question now. If you get this one right, you could score big in the next trivia game. Which came first, chicken or the egg? Egg. Wild aquatic birds emerged almost 100 million years before chickens did. 100 million years. And somewhere in that 100 million years, influenza viruses took up residence in the guts of these wild aquatic birds, like ducks and geese. And in the process, this is where we see today the natural reservoir for these viruses, many different influenza viruses. But they occasionally get out sometimes, and they start circulating in these other animals. And because we have different receptor sites, or like different locks and keys for the different viruses in terms of lung cells, in some cases, actually, some flu viruses from birds won't infect humans, some will infect humans, but they don't transmit on. A pandemic occurs when a new flu virus emerges in humans that we've not seen before, and it now readily transmits to humans by humans. This is the big bird flu pandemic we worry about. Influenza pandemics go back to antiquity. They have been as big as scourges as you could imagine. Here in 1918, this is what happened in Boston with the 1918 flu pandemic. And these were people dying from the conditions that weren't they weren't the antibiotic conditions that if we had had antibiotics, we would have saved them. These are people who are dying acutely of things that were just directly related to flu. What you see here is ages 0 to 9, 10 to 19, 20, 29, 30, 39, 40, 49, 50, 59, 60, 69. This is the historic numbers per 100,000 deaths of influenza pneumonia. You can see here 200, 300, and how it drops by age in young adults and then comes back up here. And then along came in just the 2 months of September and October in 1918. This is 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000. Almost 5% of the entire young adult population died in a period of 40 days in Boston. And today, modern medicine might have some impact on that, but it's not going to be a lot because this was not about dying of secondary bacterial pneumonias. If we have another flu virus, this could just be the case even with modern medicine. In 2009, we had a new flu virus emerge. Everybody said, oh, it was a yawner. It wasn't a big deal. Well, not actually true. The number of deaths was down, actually even lower than a regular seasonal year, but typically flu kills the much older population. None of you, you're all too young yet. But for those that are older. And what we look at is what kills you early, years of life loss. So if you're age 65, which as I get older, I realize that's not the right number anymore. It should probably be higher. But if somebody dies at age 40, that's 25 years of life lost. So that's what kills you early. If somebody dies at 5, that's 60 years of life lost. Well, if you look at what happened in 2009, and this is a paper a group of us did, the preliminary pandemic excess mortality from that 2009 pandemic far exceeded the worst seasonal flu years, even exceeded the 1958 pandemic, and began to approach the 1957. Look at that, years of life lost. We had so many young pregnant women, young people with diabetes and asthma that died. That even though the numbers were lower, they shouldn't have been dying. This is what flu did in 2009. It was almost a yawner, in a way, to most people. Well, right now we got a whole new one going on. We got a bunch of bird flu viruses, but I want to share this one with you. This is one that just scares the bejeebers out of me. This is a new virus, H7N9, another bird flu virus that emerged in China in 2013 with this big peak. few cases dripping out here, tied again to contact with poultry in China. Then along comes 2014, same month's bigger peak, and now we're minus, by the way, 55 cases here, down here. This thing's picking up, and this is going to be a much bigger peak this year, much bigger. Every time one of these viruses gets in a human, it's one more chance genetically for it to adapt, so it not only infects the humans from the bird, but transmits from human to human. What really is scary about this is it now is throughout this area of China. It's in the big bird populations, all the poultry I mentioned before. And age group-wise, it is impacting not the oldest population, but actually here even in the middle age groups, otherwise healthy people. But what fortunately hasn't happened is ongoing transmission yet. The virus has learned enough to get into people and infect them, but not yet transmit. Well, why is this a concern? Well, we're going to see more cases move around the world. Yesterday, the Canadians announced their first H7N9 case in North America, where somebody who had been in China flew back to Canada this past several weeks and actually was infected on the way back. We're now following up on the plane contacts. But what I think is most important, this is work that our group did with the group in China, where we actually got the virus from the birds 2 years ago that was infecting them, and we worked with the USDA lab in Athens, Georgia. And basically, we put this together and intentionally infected a number of birds. Most avian flu viruses come out the south end. They poop them out, and they're not very effective at getting to humans. Rarely do they ever put them out the top end, the north end, which is a much more effective way to do it. On top of it, most bird flu viruses like this kill the birds. So where there's smoke, there's fire, and you can go in and basically euthanize the flock. H7N7 is causing no illness in these birds whatsoever. Well, it turns out when we infected these quail, pigeons, and chickens, notice that the CT, or this basically the value here in our lab test, the lower the CT value is, basically the more likely it's to be positive, meaning there's a lot of virus. I just want to point out that if you look, we actually looked at OP values and CL values. This is actually oropharyngeal. This is the north end. This is the quakel samples, the south end. Notice the very high CT values here in quail for these. They weren't pooping it out, they were breathing it out. Same true with chickens. They weren't pooping it out, they were breathing it out. These are viral oozes sitting in the bird markets of China every day, and nobody's euthanizing them because they're not sick and nobody wants to. I can't think of a worse experiment that we'd want to commit right now that would enhance the ability for this virus to keep genetically changing. And you saw the seasonality of the last 3 years. Bottom line is, I don't know what the hell is going to keep this thing from just moving on, and one day, not only infecting humans, but acquiring the ability for humans to infect humans. And we're very worried about this one. Why? Well, this is an article we published last year. Good luck with flu vaccine. If you think your 23% effective vaccine was not a good shot this year, I can tell you H7N9 is even a greater challenge. We would not have an effective flu vaccine for an H7N9 pandemic. And right now, 60% of the people getting H7N9 are dying. Now that would probably come down with ongoing transmission. Even a 5%, 10% mortality rate would not be good. Let me just close here. This is the old days of mosquito control. Well, today, whether it's Aedes albopictus, the tiger mosquito, which we've now moved around the world, originally only located here before 1980, but with the tire market, where we now move tires around the world to be retreaded in cargo containers, we've now moved Aedes albopictus all around the world. Along with Aedes aegypti, another mosquito that vectors a number of different diseases, these mosquitoes are now around the world. Why is that a big deal? Because there's a new disease called chikungunya. Last December, St. Martin reported the first 2 cases of chikungunya in the Western Hemisphere. I was supposed to go on vacation here 3 months later. I canceled it. My family thought I was nuts. By the time we would have went there in March, St. Martin was absolutely in the middle of a horrible epidemic. This is a disease that doesn't kill a lot of people, 2 to 3%. But at the same time, it causes such arthritic conditions that people up to a year later literally are almost debilitated. If you look, we had no cases in the Western Hemisphere. Begin to look, and I know these slides are small, whether it's North America, Central America, Latin America, the Andes area. Bottom line is we've had over 1 million cases reported just in the last year. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. Last week alone, El Salvador reported 80,000 new cases. This mosquito did not exist literally 14 months ago in the West, or this virus didn't exist. Today, it's not just this area the WHO said in 2014. It's not just a couple areas here. This is a map from PAHO this past week. Look at this. We are now seeing indigenous transmission in southern Florida. 39 states have reported cases of people who are traveling to the Caribbean right now. You could not get me to go to the Caribbean right now on a vacation. Now, that's not a good thing to tell people because that's impacting negatively in the Caribbean economy. But it's a real challenge. This didn't exist 14 months ago, ladies and gentlemen, and there's at least 3 new viruses and mosquitoes that are going to be hitting the Caribbean soon, and us before long. Let me just say one last thing in antibiotic resistance. I mentioned it earlier. I didn't cover a lot of diseases. I didn't cover TB or HIV, or I could have covered a whole abundance of diseases today that are changing. This is one that our grandparents grew up in a pre-antibiotic era. Our grandchildren are going to start to live in a post-antibiotic era. We're going to discover some new antibiotics. We had hopefully a good find 2 weeks ago, but it's all about evolution. I mean, the bugs basically are winning. When we look at what we're doing in agriculture today, we look at what we do in human medicine, we are using antibiotics as if they're candy in many instances. Who wants to get in and work in antibiotics today in the pharmaceutical industry? We're trying to limit their use as much as possible. You know that last year, more money was made on penile enhancement drugs in this country than for all of antibiotics combined in vaccines? I mean, go where the money is. That's why you rob banks. So let me just conclude by saying, what are the issues of addressing global microbial threats? First of all, it's all about national and international partnerships. Just as Jim Kim, the president of the International Bank, just said this afternoon, I mean, there's no longer a U.S. boundary or a European boundary, an African boundary. There are no boundaries anymore when it comes to infectious diseases. The importance of preparedness, planning, and public health capacity and resources. We want to basically support public health where we're going to go out and we're going to go to the bank and we're going to get a loan and we're going to actually buy that fire truck when that third alarm goes off at one of our buildings here in town. It doesn't work that way. And we've been caught so short-footed all the time. We're now chasing down measles cases from Disneyland like you can't believe, and we can't keep up. This is Andy Granatelli, the late, great STP oil treatment guy, once said, and there's a few of you in this room who remember that, pay me now or you'll pay me later. And we don't get that. In terms of healthcare delivery systems with surge capacity today, we've got to be able to have surge capacity where we can actually respond to these big outbreaks. Today, we hear all the time about how hospitals are overstaffed. Meaning that basically, too many people, we got to cut down because of cost containment. And then as soon as there's a slight increase in cases of something, we're overwhelmed. How do we build in cost-effectively surge capacity? That's huge. We got to be more active in talking about this. 2.5 years, 3 years ago now, our group came out and said flu vaccines aren't all that good. They really don't work well. And we've been just promoting the hell out of them. And what we've done in public health is shot ourselves in the foot for 2 decades of holding back any real investment in new vaccines for flu because we've been telling everybody the ones we got are really good. We are our own worst enemy. We need new, better flu vaccines. Well, if we're not honest about what's going on, just telling it like it is, not scaring people. And if we do scare you, we don't want to scare you out of your wits, we want to scare you into your wits. What can this be? And finally, always expect the unexpected. Ebola taught us that this past year. Let me just close by saying, as Lewis Carroll once said, if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. You saw yesterday the World Health Organization board said, we got big problems. You saw today Jim Kim, the president of the World Bank, saying, we got real problems. We don't have a roadmap for what to do. Finally, my favorite philosopher of all times, Ebenezer Scrooge, once said, are these the shadows of the things that will be, or are they the shadows of the things that may be only? And for the sake of my grandkids, I hope they're only, and that's it. Thank you very much. I think we have time for a couple questions. Good. Jay? Yes, sir. I don't know if they're going to bring a mic or is it just, I guess we're getting you a mic. I'd be happy to repeat it. Go ahead.
I think whose door are you knocking on in Washington, D.C.?
It's easier if I tell you whose door I'm not. I did a whole number of briefings during the Ebola situation on the Hill in the White House, but it's an issue where, again, the partisan politics are so rancorous right now. If the other guy's got a good idea, then it's got to be a bad idea. And we just see this over and over and over again. And, you know, the president came out today. He announced a major new initiative on antibiotics, a really very thoughtful campaign. Already tonight it's getting bashed as just another government program. And yet it really is, it was put together by a group of nonpartisan scientists saying, this is it. So part of the problem we have today is that everything is so partisan, we can't see the forest from the trees. And even right here in our own local political theater here in Minnesota. And so, you know, I just have to tell you a story. Probably the most wonderful day of my life, and one of your citizens here in Minnesota or in Rochester were behind this. Back in the mid-'80s, as HIV was flaring its ugly head and all this fear and concern, the Speaker of the House, Roger Moe, the Majority Leader in the Senate, Dwayne Vinson from Lanesboro, and Dave Bishop from Rochester got together, and they had me come over in a mandatory lecture to all the House and Senate members and all their staffs for 4 hours in the House chambers. And we went through everything on HIV/AIDS. And Minnesota never once had a crazy bill. We didn't do anything but be very proactive. We had a Catholic nun for a health commissioner who couldn't have been the better health commissioner for the time. Wonderful. And we did it. Today, you couldn't do that. You couldn't do that if your life depended on it. And that's what's sad. And that's where, if anything, I would think, ask all of you to get politically involved and ask these questions. You know, that's where I find it so really difficult today, is how to get things to work and what to do. Because it's not about we're not trying. It's just partisan politics-wise, if it's the other guy's idea, it can't be any good. Yes. Yes, sir. Go. Yes, sir.
Yeah, you mentioned something about these the viruses springing up, and I remember during the war the Germans came out with DDT. Is that right?
Yes. You know, actually, I think you all heard about DDT. Let me just tell you, I'm one of the people right now desperately trying to bring back DDT. Before all of you have a heart attack, I must tell you that I am very involved with birding. I have a pair of nesting bald eagles on my property in Iowa. It's the pride and joy of my life. But most people don't understand that what happened with Silent Spring and DDT in bird populations had nothing to do with human use of DDT. Human use was less than 0.5% of all DDT, and it was very targeted. It was agricultural indiscriminate use. Today, if we could use DDT on the huts in Africa, where it's very safe for humans, it's stable, we could actually greatly reduce some of these vector-borne diseases. We can't get anybody, even the Chinese, to make DDT today because of all of the liability issues and the concerns about profit. We went way over the top. We should never bring it back for agricultural uses like that. It was wrong. But we could use it for humans today, and we can't get it. So you're right.
What I meant to say is that we had a restaurant back in the 40s, and that killed all the mosquitoes. We had used that stuff to kill them.
Yep.
But then a few years later, they say it didn't do any good, so they became immune.
I have a map, which I don't have. I should put in this talk. If you look at the spread of the mosquito that transmits yellow fever, Aedes aegypti and others, back in the 1930s, it was widespread through parts of South Africa or South America, parts of the southern part of the United States, etc. By 1970, it was down to just a few places. Today, it's much more widespread than it was in 1930. Mosquitoes have all developed resistance to most of the pesticides we have today. Just like microbes develop resistance, so do mosquitoes. Plus, just the modern world we live in. Do you know that one plastic wrapper from McDonald's, or any kind of plastic, which even the developing world is full of today, put a little raindrop on there, put a little dew on that, that's more than enough to basically raise a good several thousand mosquito larvae. And so all the garbage that exists around the world today is just the perfect receptacle for mosquito cows. And so we see much higher populations of mosquitoes today than we've ever seen in many parts of the world. And you would think, my God, with modern technology and all we could know and do, how could we be so much worse off than we were in the 1930s? That's amazing, but we are. So you're right. Yes?
Yes, you mentioned the flu vaccine, and I know the flu vaccine this year is one of the less effective versions. Would you still recommend that people take the flu vaccine, or is it so ineffectual that you wouldn't take it? And also, what could the government do to actually make the flu vaccine more effective? Like, if you were in charge, what would you do?
Well, my kids would warn you, don't ever let that happen, okay? First of all, I know less about influenza and influenza vaccine today than I did 10 years ago. I knew a hell of a lot more about it, because the more we've learned. I still think, given the abundance of information we have, surely 23% is better than 0, but it's not what we expect. My bigger concern is we're starting to get more data now showing that if you're repeatedly vaccinated year after year after year, you may actually lower your protection than if you don't get vaccinated every year. And we're in a really tough spot right now of trying to take this old 1940s vaccine and use it in ways that, we should never have intended it to be used. We need new game-changing vaccines. Our group put out a very comprehensive report 2 years ago, the CIVI report, the CIDRAP Comprehensive Influenza Vaccine Initiative report, which you can get from our site if you go to it. It was a blue ribbon panel from around the world participated in this, and we said we got to stop talking about, and we really got to actually fund new vaccine work. On top of that, we got to get the industry to get involved. It's going to take $1 billion to bring a new flu vaccine to market. And it's going to be a brand new one. We're going to have to learn how does it work, the different pieces to it, etc. We could do it. But Francis Collins, who I have great respect for as head of NIH, said 5 years ago he'd have a game-changing flu vaccine in 5 years. I have Francis' quote every year for the last 5 years saying, we'll have one in 5 more years. Last week he said, we'll have one in 5 years. After a while, credibility becomes an issue there. It's because we have not invested, nor has anybody else in the world, though. Europe hasn't either. One day we're going to regret this one. Trust me, this is the one I know we're going to regret. Because seasonal flu is one thing, it's not good. But it is nothing to what a pandemic will do. Not a one thing a pandemic will do. So we really have got to deal with the issue of a new flu vaccine. And it's going to take a public-private partnership. We're learning that with the Ebola vaccine. If we don't have the drug manufacturers involved with this, we can't move anything forward. And so it's going to take the public saying this. We have a blueprint report of what to do, how to do it, how to get financing. Right now, nobody in the private sector world will invest in this because they don't see a return on investment. Because public health keeps telling them the one we got is good enough, we just got to get more people vaccinated. They don't see any return on investment for that. Today, if we had a flu vaccine that we had to give once every 10 years, protected against most strains, which we actually think we could possibly do, think how that would change the pharmaceutical industry market. We got a lot of headwind there, but it can be done. It's just we got to get the public behind it saying we want new and better flu vaccines. Every time you talk to your congressman or any national elected officials, ask them why they're not doing more on this. And put the screws to them, okay? And go to our website, and there's a blueprint for exactly how to do it.
Where is the money going to come from to address these problems that you're talking about?
It's actually kind of coming part from people like you. I'm sitting here kind of, giving you the message, what we know, what we see. After a while, people kind of just want to tune out because they don't want another problem. It was interesting because I realize I have a reputation for, people say, well, he just scares the hell out of you. And I found it so interesting during the Ebola situation because I wrote an op-ed piece in the New York Times in which I talked about how many of the Ebola virologists are frightened about it, airborne transmission, which, by the way, I'm on a paper with 21 other Ebola virologists coming out in a couple of weeks talking about that very issue, that respiratory transmission is real, so it's just not me. But it was interesting because somebody in the BBC wrote an op-ed piece about me, saying, well, here's a guy that just scares the hell out of everybody, and they cited a reporter or an op-ed person who wrote about back in 2008 where I had predicted that we'd see a return of another flu strain that would cause a pandemic, and that smallpox wasn't just in 2 labs in the world, and that, in fact, we're going to start seeing more mosquito-borne diseases that were going to spread into the Americas and cause real problems. And I thought, thank you for using that. At the time, it was supposed to be a cut, saying I'm just scaring people. All 3 of them had come true. All 3 of them had come true. This past summer, we found smallpox in a lab in NIH that nobody knew about. It wasn't just in 2 labs. The mosquitoes are here, chikungunya, and we had a 2009 influenza pandemic. So part of it is, how do you keep saying these things with credibility to get people to believe you? And, it's like a bad intersection where you keep having accident after accident after accident. Everybody goes and complains about it, but nobody does anything about it. One day, we just got to get the powers to be to say, we've got to look at these issues. We've got to deal with them. I live in Lake Minnetonka up there, right across from Christmas Lake in the Twin Cities. We're watching, the whole invasive species issue in our waterways in Minnesota. 15 years from now, we're all going to wonder, what the hell are we doing? Why do we let this happen? So I think it's the collective we. It's people raising the question. It's why you're here tonight. I mean, I'm sure you didn't come here just to humor me, you know. And, I mean, you're here because you're concerned about this. And so I think that's where we have to really get it. It's in our education systems, it's in our governments. We got to say there's much more we need to do here. Let me just tell you right now, if you look at the actual budget for health, which is really all about disease, public health right now accounts for 0.001% of the entire expenditure of health in this country. Now, isn't that kind of wrong? I mean, I'd rather prevent it than treat it. I'd rather not have it happen than have to respond to it. And yet we are so focused on treative medicine. You know, we'll spend $87,000 to keep us alive for 4 more weeks at the end of our life, but we won't think about what we could do so our kids and grandkids don't have to grow up with all this stuff. That's the challenge. Yes?
Well, I want you to know you have scared the hell out of me.
No,
so just
scare you into your wits, not out of your wits.
Initially, but I'm fortunate to work with high school students, and in this generation of students, I have actually very great hope with them being able to solve these problems with their intelligence and resourcefulness. But my question for you is, what do the young generations now need to be learning as far as topics and skills? What is it that as educators we need to do for our high school and college students right now so that they will be prepared to face all these challenges? You know, we hear about 21st century skills and what you should know, but in your opinion, you know, we've got students right now who are in school and are getting ready to, you know, grow up and be you, and what should they be doing now? It has to be different than what you did when you were their age.
Yes, thank you for that. And by the way, there's a group here from Faribault of young students here tonight that are all going to take care of me when I get old. Thank you. I'm very glad you're here. You know, I think that the key message is, first of all, let's just not sugarcoat it. Damn it, we've screwed up the world for you badly. My generation is going to hand off the world to the next generation in the worst condition ever in the passing of a generation. We have so many issues right now. And you could sit there and get mad at us. You could sit there and tell us we got to fix it, but we're not. And it's not going to help to be mad. The only get out of jail card you got is basically to try to fix it yourselves and change it. And so I think from that standpoint, feel empowerment and don't accept the fact that it's like this. I'm concerned about, in the world of information today, misinformation has become the guide. I mean, look at immunizations. While we have a problem with flu vaccines not being as effective as we want, we have the most incredible armamentarium of public health tools called vaccines, and yet we've got a growing anti-science group out there that basically just poo-poos and says, I don't want some toxic thing in my body. Some of the least safe food we have today is what people sell as quote-unquote safe food. The last food I'll eat today is organic food. I can give you all kinds of reasons why there's terrible problems with contamination and issues and so forth. On the other hand, food irradiation, which is that energy we used to be in the big tube of your TV, that's an electron gun, that's what you irradiate food with, that could overnight completely change foodborne disease in this country or the world. And it's very cheap, very effective, and yet you've got people out there saying terrible things about it. Ironically, when it was first licensed for use back in the 1950s, right after, or 1940s, right after World War II, it was set up to a standard that said it can do no harm. You can't even have a significant reduction of vitamins. And it's the only technology today that you can do no harm. If aspirin were held to that same standard, it wouldn't be on the market. And yet we're not doing it. So I think part of it is information. What can we really do something about? What can't we do about it? You know, nobody wants to pay a pharmaceutical company to do something because they make enough money. But on the other hand, we're going to have to invest in antibiotics. We're going to have to invest in things that control, you know, vectors like mosquitoes and so forth. And if the private sector makes money on it, we need them. We got to have them. It's about being penny wise and pound foolish. But we've got to have these frank discussions about what we're going to do about this. You know what? Aid. If you look at foreign aid, you know, I'm on the Council of Foreign Relations. I deal a lot with international issues. I mean, when you look at military aid and all this other aid, you know, public health aid, as Jimmy Carter would tell you, sometimes is the very most effective aid there's possible, because that's what empowers the populations to become economically effective. That's the hardest aid to get out there today because it's seen as just being nice. So I think we just have to have really frank discussions. How do we help build the world out of this issue? How do we try to deal with it? Why are we going to wait until that virus jumps from Saudi Arabia across the Red Sea to East Africa and then spend bazillions of dollars trying to figure out what the hell we're going to do to stop it? You know, any businessman who are in their business like we run public health priorities would be bankrupt and out of business years ago. So I think it's just that kind of conversation and not being afraid to say these things. And then also saying when things work. What works and why. Vaccines work. They're incredible. You know, we could do a lot of different things there. So I think that's the issue. But most importantly, students, it's your world. We're turning it over to you. Okay, I'm sorry. But you don't have, like I said, a get out of jail card. So I look forward to the solutions you're going to bring to the table. And for my grandkids' sake, thank you. Two more and then we're done. Okay, yes.
Answer, I've got one over here.
Over here? Okay. Right here. One here. Go ahead, sir.
So you talk about, preventative, is ideal.
Yep.
Right? And we need to be strategic in terms of resources. In 76 or 75 when we first were introduced to Ebola, it seems like there was an opportunity there to make a vaccine.
Yep.
And now we're kind of chasing that. How do you prioritize those threats with the resources out there?
The Ebola situation is a good one because I would have told you we should not have invested in a new Ebola vaccine. When you got that many more people dying of malaria, you got them dying of so many other disease conditions, those are the vaccines we should have first. But we got to have a prepared response system like a fire company that when a crisis does happen can quickly get in there. And we didn't have that. That's what made this situation get worse. Now we know Ebola should go up the ranks because of the needs now of how we can see it can spread in the megacities of the developing world. So now we need to reprioritize there. But many more people in Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea died over the last 12 months from HIV, from malaria, from diarrheal diseases, from lack of maternal health, from TB. So I don't want to minimize those. It's a whole infrastructure itself. And now we're going to be paying for that for a long time to come to try to keep the health infrastructure as much as we have there. So I think it's just prioritizing honestly. Let me just, one quick little story. If I have a choice to protect any of you in this room against flu and I had an effective vaccine, I only had a limited number, I wouldn't give it to any of you first. You know who I'd give it to? I'd give it to those guys you get really mad at that drive the coal trains through town. I'd give it to all the coal train engineers. You know why? Because right now 40% of the electricity in this country comes from coal. Right now coal is a just-in-time delivery product for many of the electrical generators in this country because they're burning Powder River Basin coal, which is what comes through Rochester, on the coal trains. And it turns out for much of the coal train reach, these coal train engineers are just like the old riverboat captains where they only run 300 miles of track. Because these 110-car trains are so unique, so special in terms of their weights and so forth. If they're going more than 38 miles an hour in one turn, they tip over. If they're not going 42 miles an hour at this, they won't get over that mountain, but they got to be careful because the back 16 cars are on the way down and the other ones are going up. And these guys are so specialized, they only run 300 miles of track back and forth. That's it. They know every inch of that track. If we lose them during the flu pandemic, we will lose electricity within 3 to 5 weeks. If we lose electricity, everything else is off. So there's an example you got to just think out of the box. You got to basically connect dots and say, if I want to protect Grandpa and Grandma right now, I'm going to make damn sure we have electricity. Then I'll worry about what else to do. So it's that kind of thinking. I think last question up here. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, yeah. Okay, sure. Go ahead.
You mentioned many issues across the world today in public health. So where do you think the public health is heading in the next 50 to 100 years? You've able to predict pandemics, but do you think you can predict how things will look across the world in that time period?
I think if you look at the history of humankind, we've gone through very dark periods and we've gone through enlightened periods. I think we're in a very different time now just because of global communication, whether it be actual movement of people and goods, whether it be ideas, ideology, all those things. And I think we're in a very challenging time that way. At the very heart of me, I believe people are more good than they are bad in every instance. I believe that in the end, for self-enlightenment, we will see that investing in some of these things sure makes a heck of a lot more of a business sense than letting them happen and then we have to pay for them later. I think it's just unfortunate sometimes we have to learn hard lessons before we get there. You know, how many more bridges are going to have to collapse before we actually realize it's probably a good idea to have a bridge maintenance program? You know, because we surely pay for it in the bottom end of it when they collapse, okay, in a lot of ways. I think public health is that way too. Again, remember, we're all going to die in this room. So we're not going to limit the top 10 causes of death. But I think we're going to have more honest intellectual discussions about, do I want to pay those $48,000 for the last 6 weeks of life? You know, I'm at the University of Minnesota, where I get in trouble all the time because I ask myself, is that really what we want to put our money as? Another startup company that creates a drug that'll keep you alive for 4 weeks longer for $48,000? Is that the values that we're valuing, or is it how we live and die in dignity and grace and pain-free for as long as possible and deal with that? Well, in a university like ours, where, you know, IPOs and startup companies and new drugs are a big deal, you know, you have to have that discussion. I think public health will be there. I think we'll see that it's not just, you know, being nice to people to make sure there's infrastructure around the world. You know, just recently I've dealt with several situations where IT technologists, high-level IT technologists, have come from India to the United States where they've had drug-resistant TB. Because in India right now, drug-resistant TB has become much more common in the middle class. It's no longer just in the slums of Mumbai and places like that. Do you know what that does economically when suddenly your IT expertise is bringing in a dreaded disease like that? I mean, the cost has been huge to follow up on these. Somebody will say, why don't we stop having these people get TB in India? So I think that in the end, I think we will see that. It's just it takes a while for people to get there, and how many crises we have to go through before it happens. So, yes, one last one. I'm sorry, yeah.
My question's a two-part question. I said, with all the deadly viruses and diseases today, would you suggest to prevent them from the country of origin that they're from, or would you suggest to, like, prevent them from spreading to the other countries? And what advice would you give for future generations about the rise of these viruses?
Well, first of all, can I ask you what country you're from?
Yeah.
Which one?
Somalia.
Somalia?
Yeah.
Thank you for being here. And I hope that, you know, countries like yours are classic examples of where it's not about just being kind, it's being strategically smart, it's being wise to invest in the health infrastructure of countries like Somalia. I think that's really important. We should deal with the diseases where they're at. Not because we just don't want to deal with them, but it's easier to deal with them there. I mean, so what is the root cause? You know, think of this. If I could just get a couple of really rich sheikhs right now to invest in camel vaccines, we might be able to stop MERS from happening through all this region of the world. You know, we wouldn't have to worry about camels in Somalia. You know about camels in Somalia. Imagine if MERS takes off in Somalia. So I think that part of it is, how do we get people to understand that kind of thing, that it's actually in everyone's best interest. It's a global interest. It's not just about being nice or altruistic, as I've said. So we should deal with them there. For you, I would say one of the things that we have to understand also is that international health today should be every bit as important as neighborhood health, because far too often international health and neighborhood health get connected really very, very tightly. So, you know, we can all look at where we're from, what we do, but we're all one world when it comes to infectious diseases. There's not a lot of things you can say that are like that, but infectious diseases, they really are. So you know, we need to be supporting work throughout the world. Is it acceptable to have less than one physician per 100,000 population in a country with such dire problems when we're sitting here with the riches we have? You know, the fact of the matter that 80 people right now in this world control half of all the wealth, you know, what does that mean? You know, and it's getting more despair. I think that's what we need to do, and that's obviously coming from a naive infectious disease epidemiology who still believes in the better good of man over bugs. Thank you very much.
And before anybody takes off, I will have you pick our door prize winner for tonight, if you would.
I get to pick?
Yes.
Okay, let's see here. Okay, glasses here. What, can I ask what it is?
It's a $20 gift card to the M Gear store.
Mike Osterholm! No, I'm joking. Ken?
Yep.
Ken Dilly?
Ken, is it Dilly?
Ken? Congratulations!
And thank you everybody for coming out tonight. We hope to see you next week.